Okay, are we ready? Good morning, everybody. I see you just had an hour of sustainability. We are going to talk about trust and reputation and sustainable business. But before we start, I'd like to introduce ourselves a little bit. That's us down there. And many of you probably have not heard of us. We are a global organization and we're all over the world, but we're probably less visible in this part of the world than we are. We work a lot with companies facing problems, and those problems might be restructuring, going bust. We help restructure companies, we help them go into administration. Governments hire us to help companies reach a firm landing, a bit like Thomas Cook, though we don't represent Thomas Cook. We also do e-discovery. We do a lot of cybersecurity work. We do, for instance, in Brazil, for the oil and gas issue there, we did a lot of technical work on computers, looking at what's actually happened and where the mistakes and where the graft and where the corruption was, and what the exposure of companies were. And the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme we were involved in, and we did a lot of the investigation there. So we work in that area. We do forensic risk and investigation as well. And Liz and I are in the communications part, strategic communications, because of all the things we're talking about, they all have a reputation consequence. When companies have problems and they go into administration, or they have problems of any sort, there's a reputation risk attached to it. And so that's the space we work in, and that's why we work in an organization like that. So a little bit about myself before Liz introduces herself. I've been working for FTI now for a few years. I work mainly in the oil and gas business, because that's my background. I work all over the world. I've worked in the US in the last few years, in West Africa, in China quite a lot. But most of my life has been in Shell, and I've worked in Nigeria, in the Middle East, in Kazakhstan. It's what? Do I take this off? Is that better? It's buzzing. Okay. Madonna never had this problem. Okay, so I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Central Asia, I spent 10 years in China, and I've been working in that time in the communication space and sustainability, helping Shell overcome some of the biggest issues that they faced in the last 20 or 30 years. In fact, I opened The Guardian, or I went online on The Guardian newspaper, the campaigning newspaper in England, only yesterday, and I saw Today in Focus, and it was a court case in the Netherlands about Nigeria and about Shell in Nigeria, going back to 1995, when 9 people were executed by the military government after a military tribunal, and those 9 people were campaigning against Shell. And at the time, it was the biggest shock Shell had come across. I was living in Lagos at the time. We ended up 12 years later in New York in a human rights court case. And the story was there yesterday, because of the court cases are still going on. So it's still relevant today. So that's me, and that's why I'm up here to some extent, I guess. And Liz, I hand over to Liz.
Hello, hi, assalamu alaikum. So I'm Liz, I'm the MD for FTI Malaysia. I'm here, I was formerly from the corporate, going into consulting about 4 years ago, because I felt that maybe I could bring value to the organization in Malaysia in managing their reputation. Because I think in Malaysia, there's less awareness when it comes to reputation. You look at everything else. You know, I sat in some boards and we talked about financials, investments, but we never really looked about reputation and how it can affect us and our business. And I think it's important for organizations to understand that, and as board members to look at it and question maybe the senior management in your office, in your organization, whether they have actually looked at how they manage the company's reputation, especially when you're going out to invest in different parts of the world. So that's me and Nick. We're going to do a bit of sparring. So I did some risk management and told him I'm never going to use that because I felt that that Madonna kind of mic will always create a lot of problems. So I was smart enough to request for this. So obviously Nick has yet to learn his lesson. Yannick?
Well, 5 minutes being Madonna was worth it, probably. Okay. So we have a presentation here, and where, you know, what we've put together is something that we think you want to hear, and it's about where we are at the moment, how the world is changing, what the risks are for business, corporates, particularly the leadership and the boardroom, and then look at the things that a little bit about crisis as well, and about a few things that you might think about changing, or things that need to be changed in my experience and in Liz's experience. But it's quite a small group here, and we're a little bit uncertain about your experience or background. So I'm much more interested actually in having a conversation with you. You're in this room because you have an interest in this subject, and your interest might translate itself into a question. So if you've got questions, you know, we can have a discussion, and we don't have to go through many of the slides. Maybe one or two I can show, which have got a few conclusions in them and things that can be done differently. So we will start going, and if you do have questions or you've got concerns and you're here for a reason and you want to know what the answer is, or you want to hear a view about what the answer is, because the thing about reputation is there aren't any answers. There are more questions, and there are lots of different answers. Some of them are better than others, but there's no single solution to any particular problem. So if you can, you know, we're very happy to take questions anytime. This is rather a grotesque slide to start with. And I'm sorry if it spoiled your breakfast or your makan. But we've moved on one already. Okay. Yeah, no, I like the first one better. But it, you know, but it's sort of, you've got the slides. Okay. So we can, it's sort of, for me, it shows how much the world has changed. When I got to China in 1999 to work, and I stayed there 10 years for Shell, 4 billion invested at that time. When I got there, Clinton was the president of the US, and the US and Europe, if you like, was the voice of reason in the world. They were the sensible sort of global voice of reason. And China was a little bit, was certainly mistrusted, still is today, but even more so in those days, negotiating to join the WTO at the end. And they were very outspoken about climate change and other things for good reason. And when I think back to those days, and I think today to now, how the world has flipped on its head, right? And now Xi Jinping is the voice of reason in a world that's completely turned upside down. That's the sort of world you're dealing with in business these days, and as board members you're dealing with. So you know, people like Trump and Boris Johnson have completely changed the way politics is done. There's a rise in nationalism, populism has exploded. I think it's a record numbers of people in Europe are now voting for nationalist or populist leaders. It's happening in this part of the world, it's happened in the Philippines, so it's not just a European or a Western thing, it's happening all over the place. Truth doesn't seem to matter anymore. Fake news is being talked about all the time, and people use it to their own benefit whenever they feel like it. Lying has become fashionable. There's a breakdown of trust. You know, if I think to the Brexit issue, which is still going on after God knows how long, it's, you know, everybody's so fed up with it, they just want it to end. They don't care anymore. But the campaign that Boris Johnson ran was about saving a certain number of, I can't remember how many $1 million a day just by leaving the EU. And that was the campaign pledge, and that drove a lot of the votes, and it's just not true. But it happened. And nobody seems to mind. It's become more like a children's playground than it ever has before. So what's being said matters less and less, and what people are looking for, how people appear is much more important. So it makes it a much more difficult and we can move on one, and world for business. So the growing risk for businesses is because of the increased nationalism and the splintered viewpoints, is that you face unprecedented pressure from all sides, from lots of different stakeholders who are more empowered than they've ever been before, because they have the social media and they have a voice now to give them the voice that they never had before, and they were always sidelined and in the background, annoying mosquito whine, but now they're a jumbo jet on the runway and you can hear them very loudly. So things have changed a lot. Regulatory hurdles are increasing, government policies are changing. My wife was in a board meeting for the Oman LNG yesterday, and a lot of Omani board members were there, and while they were there, they discovered that the government in Oman had reshuffled. I think they created a new tax ministry, several major changes in personnel, and the guys there, who some of them were senior government members, didn't even know about it. So even in the Middle East, where I would call Oman one of the most gentle and probably moderate countries, things are happening which are quite surprising. And the Arab Spring, if you go back a few more years, shows that nowhere is immune to difficulties. So your complexities are increasing. So what we're doing here is painting a picture which I'm sure you're aware of, that you're facing unprecedented challenge in your business and in managing your business. And of course, Malaysia's been through much change as well. And here's a little bit about why, and the radicalism that's increasing, and I quite like this wheel of an internet minute. If you just look and see how much happens in a minute, how can you possibly stay on top of that? You have to accept as a business that there's things going on you can't control and you're never going to control, and you shouldn't try and control. And the trick is to know what you need to understand, what you need to know, and then what you can influence and how you can manage your business because of it. It's quite a startling statistic in there.
I used to work in a telco, if you don't mind. When I worked in the telco, they were just about to launch 3G. And at that time, when we launched 3G, we were talking about the disruption of 3G and the video calls. And you had to pay a lot for video calls. Now it's free. And as much as we try to predict what's going to happen 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road, we never expected how it happened now. So at that time, we were just talking about, husband in a karaoke somewhere, and the wife call, and they need to do a video call, and they do not want them to see. So we thought it was really funny at that time. And we make jokes about it as telcos. And then now, it's happening. So we looked at the kids, everybody have a handphone. You used to talk about only one handphones. Now I'm sure everyone here would have at least 2 or 3 handphones. Maybe 4, I don't know, right? So things have changed and everybody's well connected. So whatever stories that you try to hide, that you think you can, will definitely get a headline somewhere, sometime in the near future. So that's how your reputation is at risk.
Yeah, there are no secrets. And you need to ask yourself, in this very febrile and uncertain environment, are you ready for it? So what are you doing that's different, or what have you changed that helps you be better prepared for a situation like this, so that you have the reputation capital, that people trust you, and they will give you the benefit of the doubt when something goes wrong, because something will go wrong. You must assume that's going to happen. They say in cybersecurity, isn't it, there's only 2 sorts of companies, those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. So that's the sort of situation you're in. There is no escape. Now, there's some companies have, escaped so far, but we don't know how long that's going to last. Actually, Petronas is one example of a company that has been through quite a long, it's been in existence quite a long time. It hasn't gone through a major crisis like most of the oil and gas companies in the world. Like the one I was in, Shell, we've been through 2 or 3 in that time. One with firebombing petrol stations and stuff like that. They haven't, but they better be ready for it because it's going to happen one day, probably. So do you have the reputation capital to escape and manage your reputation if something goes wrong? Are you ready for it? Are you planning for it? Have you put the contingencies in place? And what are the processes that you have in place to make sure that you are ready for it? This is the sum. This slide is a sum of 30 years' experience. We're not really ready for this yet. Even working for a company like Shell, which is seen as one of the better or one of the best in terms of stakeholder management, understanding risk, understanding issues, being receptive to issues. And they're in a very good place at the moment since I left. Taking a very strong view about climate change and about renewable energy. That's the second cycle they've been through doing that. So they're in a very good position at the moment, but they haven't really adapted. They hadn't really adapted to the challenges that were coming down the line. And their leadership team, and a lot of leadership teams, so I'll move away from Shell, the leadership teams are still comprised of the people that made up leadership teams 10 years, 15 years ago. So you've got the finance person, you've got the HR person, you've got the operations person probably, you've got the legal person, and you've got the business people, the business leaders. Yet, today, your biggest risk, and surveys, global surveys have shown that 87% of CEOs reckon that reputation risk is the most important or the most pressing risk they're facing anywhere, and reputation is 25% of your market value. This is the pressing risk these days. That's what CEOs are telling pollsters. That's what the evidence shows. It's not about the financial risk from the decisions you make on big projects like building a new LNG plant in Canada or something. Those things are largely internal. They're risk and they're very important, but the big risks are the ones, the external risks, the ones you've got less control over and things can happen to you. And most leadership teams are made up of people who don't have that experience. Now, there's usually some very good people on that leadership team who have gained the experience over the years, but they're not trained for it, and you're depending on having that experience in the boardroom or in the leadership team that can help you in those circumstances. Then you've got people who are sensitive to it. But you have a finance person there for good reason. All the people are on the board for very good reason, not on the board, sorry, on the leadership team for very good reasons. And they're all really important. But there's one risk that's not being managed in a way that you would say that given the risk you're facing and the response you need to give, why is the leadership team comprised the way it is? Now, one of the things that is quite interesting, and the same thing applies to the board, yeah? So on the boards where you have experience, perhaps, are there people with that reputation experience, or do you bring in externally that reputation experience? And Liz sits on several boards, so I know there's companies that do it, and a lot of companies are doing it now, and bringing in people with precisely that experience for that reason. But this is an area of where leadership teams are ill-equipped to manage what's happening.
I mean, gone are the days when I used to practice in corporate. Gone are the days where the CEO will look at you, comms people, and say, "Can you please get that story out there in the newspaper?" People don't read the newspaper anymore, so they don't really trust the newspaper because it's just paid advertising. Sometimes is It's just a way or a conduit for you to put your message out there. So how do you actually build reputation? So it's basically not as easy as you imagine it to be. So it's basically looking at your processes, what are the DNA of the organization, your integrity level, how trustworthy you are, and how you communicate to your stakeholders and your shareholders. That will culminate into the reputation of the organization. But if you don't talk about yourself, then nobody's going to know who you are. How are you going to be able to raise the price of your shares if you're not going to talk about your key successes? How would they know that you have all these best practices looking at sustainability, SDGs and all that if you don't communicate? So the challenge is basically how you communicate to your audiences. Is about how you carry yourself and what kind of reputation you think that your organization have. So if you were to look at GE14, right? So GE13, I remember when that happened, everybody said, oh, because all the social media guys are talking about it. They are the one who create the viral and stuff like that. And then you see some movement in GE14. Nobody was listening to the media. Everybody was going into social media to find out what's really happening. Although you know that it might be just lies, right? Chances are it's just a WhatsApp that has been circulating for the past 10 years and you, not really 10 years, maybe 5 years, and you just assume it's the truth. And then when G14 happened, I remember the media actually gained some momentum. People are now reading the newspaper and, read the social media and verifying it with the newspapers. So there's a bit of shift. So where are we now in Malaysia? Are we still doing that or are we still reading social media? I know I'll wake up in the morning, I'm one of those people, the minute I open my eyes, I look at my phone. Because just in case I have clients who are in crisis and they need my help. Not really because I'm interested in what's happening, but I will always open my Facebook first to find out what are the stories that's happening and who is going to tell me this story at 4 o'clock in the morning. And you do have friends who does that. How many times have you received a WhatsApp and it's about a story about 5 years ago and they talked about it as if it happened yesterday and it went viral again? Imagine having to go through that with your reputation every year. Chances are every month. So things... No, they don't, yeah. Because it's fun, right? So I think years ago I remember there was Malaysia basically have the highest social media user in the world. That was pre-GE14, GE13. Imagine that. So I was scared when I saw that. Everybody is an opinion leader. Everybody has to say something about your reputation, your organization reputation, your board reputation. Everybody question your credibility and whether you are doing the right job or not. So everybody is an opinion leader. So that's a bit scary. I think the world is moving in a very fast pace and things are getting scarier.
And there's one example of of leadership understanding. There was I won't identify the company, but a large company building a major industrial plant facility overseas, Asian company in Canada, and there's indigenous people were affected by this. Indigenous people have to be treated very carefully and with more care and in a different way to ordinary communities, right? They have a tie to the land that means they need a different way of being treated. And they were offered several, I think it was about $10 million. See, I'm not naming the example, I can make up the figure, right? So say $10 million they were going to be given as part of a settlement that was going to be for investment over the next 5 years for them, for their cultural, for their economic development. And they were offered that and they turned it down. And the next day the leadership team in this company were looking around and saying, I didn't know that was going to happen. And they had no idea it was going to happen. They had no idea it was coming down. They knew that it was going to be offered. This was going to be a good news story, right? It turned into a disaster because they turned it down. They said, that's a bribe, and you're not listening to us. Now, Why didn't that leadership team know? That leadership team should have been aware that was one of their biggest projects, a significant project for them, should have been aware that that was a risk. There was a risk there that that was going to happen. Now, people on the ground knew there was a risk. My job for the last 20 years was about understanding what those risks are and making sure you were going to mitigate them. You understood them, you were engaged, you knew what people were thinking, you knew that what they were saying, you knew what their expectations were and how you needed to respond to them to get a project sorted out. That wasn't going up to the top line. Now, I'm sure the company was very well aware about the procurement risks, about getting the right materials to that project on time, getting the contracts in place, getting the contractors in place, getting the workforce in place. And all those things are important, of course, but not the most important thing, because that could have stopped the project in its tracks. So that's just an example it's a failure in one way, but it's a lack of process internally in the organization to make sure that your risk management system or issues management system really does highlight the risks that are the most important at the moment. Now, all companies have an enterprise risk management system. And in my experience, it doesn't work very well when you're talking about reputation risk, because you always have to put a figure, a headline figure on how much it's going to cost you, and that's a very difficult thing to do. It could cost you everything. And I've been wrong in the past where I've said, this is going to cost you if you don't do this. And somebody chose not to do it, and they got away with it, right? So you never know. There's always an uncertainty there that can't be discounted.
So when you talked about risk and talked about crisis, sometimes nowadays, even an executive transition can also be seen as a crisis. There will be a lot of speculation on executives when they leave that organization, including boards. So whenever you leave, and they will ask, so why are they leaving? Is there some bad practices within the organization that they disagree upon? Is there some decision that was not true or correct? Or are they not politically aligned, right? So all that will actually be part and parcel of your reputation. We give a bit of example there, just to remind you of some of the crises that has happened in Malaysia. But I always believe when there's an accident or an incident, sometimes you can't control. But in a lot of crises, it's about something that you know is going to happen. Maybe you don't say it, or maybe you don't highlight it for fear or whatever. But most of the time, crisis is something that you know. And I always asked my bosses previously and asked him, are we just having a bad day, or we are having a bad hair day, or is it a crisis? Because sometimes it's not even a crisis. You know, when social media was at rise, right? I remember whenever they see a social media post on a Twitter, and the CEO will then look at you and say, hey, they're talking about this. But then nobody really talked about you. Chances are you are item number 3,600 at the bottom page. And the top one would be about some politician. Some of those kind of social media crises that you face in organization, something that you don't really have to respond. So knowing when to respond and when not to respond is important. How you safeguard your narrative, how you say it, or how you want to communicate is very important. And we have seen it in many cases. And I think we all have seen what happened to MH370 when that happened, when you do not get your narrative right. And again, in many cases, if you don't repeat your brand at least 1,000 times, nobody's going to remember who you are. So if you don't build your reputation, someone else is going to do it for you. So you need to be able to have that, the back of your mind. So we are going to go to the next. Now, this is actually our favorite slide. I'm sure you know this guy.
Sunday, BP's CEO apologized.
We're sorry. We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. I'd like my life back.
Life here may never be the same. The water and...
So this is Tony Hayward. So FTI was actually working for the rig company, the rig that blew up, the company Transocean. There's actually one Malaysian director on that board, Yannick here, who's not here today, I think. old boss. He's my old boss. We were working for the Transocean, so we were very closely involved in this and helping manage their profile. Tony Hayward lost his job over this, and he was one of the 32% of senior executives who lose their job. And those statistics are from a survey that we did of 100 different crises of major companies that we were involved in over the years. But if you look at the clip, he said sorry, right? If you go to the crisis courses that teach you the best thing to say, and sorry is a great thing to say, though legal will tell you not to say sorry. And that happened a lot in this case as well. I'll say something about that. But he said sorry, which was good, but then he went on to say something really silly, right? And he didn't mean it like that, of course, but it just went viral, and it destroyed him. It wasn't the only silly thing he said. But the interesting thing was that he'd said this to a bunch of journalists before when he was taking them offshore to a rig, or he's taking them off to show them the burning rig. So he went with them, and he was just chatting to them. They were all print journalists. They didn't have a camera. And he said roughly the same thing, and they ignored it, right? Because of the way he said it and the context it was said in, they understood he was just expressing frustration that he couldn't do more, and he wanted to fix it so that everybody could be, go back to normal, including himself. But, so it's interesting that depending on where you are and who you are, where you are and who you're talking to, it can make a big difference. So he said it once, and he probably felt quite confident to say it again. But one of the things that is clear in this sort of crisis communication or crisis situation these days is you don't have any time, and you don't have, and the risks are now so high and so and have to be managed so quickly that you need to change your perceptions a bit. When I first started in the business, going back again, legal was the biggest voice in the room. Because in those days, it was the biggest risk, right? If you said the wrong thing, not many people heard it, and it might have been reported, but you might end up in court and lose a lot of money. But you're not going to lose much reputation because of it. These days, it's the other way around. The risk from not saying something that people want to hear because there's a legal implication is much greater in terms of bottom line impact than actually, so being truthful or being open and honest leaves you in a much better financial position than staying quiet and quoting the legal approach, which is, we got no comment on that. And that makes you very safe in a courtroom, but you lose a lot more money. And BP had experience of that. If anybody ever saw the inquiries, the congressional inquiries, where Hayward and several others were sat on a chair and senators asked them questions, and the number of times they said, we can't respond to that. It was just terrible television. It just looked like they were hiding things all the time, and they were just taking legal advice. And what they would have said if they hadn't had that legal advice would have been a lot better. They'd have been in a lot better place, and it cost them a lot of money. Now, there's never a control point, so you don't know if they'd taken a different approach how much it would have cost them then. You'll never know that, but it didn't do them any good. That's for sure.
And I think in most crises, taking hold of your narrative is important. How you manage the media, how you manage your stakeholder, and speaking through one voice is much more important than giving the mic to someone else. I think in most cases, whenever there's a crisis, there's always this person who wants to go and speak to the media. I call that the Gila mic syndrome, right? So they just want to take the mic because it's fun. And because I'm going to be famous, I'll get my 2 minutes of fame and I'll be fantastic. So that doesn't apply now. So when there's a crisis, there will always need to be a gag order. But you must always communicate. And most CEOs will ask, when do they communicate? And the board will ask, should we be communicating? I will tell you, yes, you should. Keeping quiet will allow people to speculate what happened to your organization, which you do not want people to speculate the wrong things when that was not what really happened. And because when that speculation becomes viral, then it's going to be very difficult for you to stop it. And of course, there's a lot of debate, even between us communicators. Should you say sorry? Shouldn't you say sorry? And, you know, admitting culpability is actually a good thing. But how do you do it and when you do it, that will usually be a discussion in your crisis communications room when that happens. How fast can you get that press release out? What are you going to say in that press release? How transparent can you be? How do you communicate to the internal guys? Remember, you have internal audience, so stakeholders, it's not just the people externally, it's also your internal guys who will also speculate on what's happening. So how do you communicate with them? How do you tell them that, hey, please don't speculate. I'm going to tell you this, but please don't say this. You know, I remember when I was in one of the, you know, we had a town hall and the CEO gave a speech and the comms people said, okay, nobody needs to, don't, just keep it quiet until 5 p.m. And the announcement was made at 4:06, there was a Twitter. So imagine that. Everybody would have a handphone. So how do you control that? So I would tell you there's no way to control it, but you can still able to manage it when the time comes, right? So how do you manage that too? Yeah? So there's no quick and fast answer to that. Do you have a quick and fast answer to?
No, I'm not quick and fast. I'm too old. But I did do some work here in Malaysia with a big company, and we were doing some crisis work, and I asked a head of a major industrial facility, how long does it take you to get a press release out if there's a disaster? He was very proud. He said 24 hours. And that was good, you know, that was good by Malaysia terms. And I sort of looked at him and thought, you know, no, I understand the answer. Big corporate organizations, the bigger the organization, the less nimble you are. And also organizations where you feel you have to go all the way up the line to get approval and it comes all the way back down before you can say anything is about the worst thing that can happen. And 24 hours, of course, you've got maybe 30 seconds. And you know, by the time the press release came out 24 hours later, it was completely irrelevant because the story had moved on and you'd already been condemned and hanged and found guilty by then. Or you get found guilty before you get hanged, don't you? So sometimes it's the other way around. Yeah. But if you think about what does a board, one of the interesting things is what does a board do for a crisis? Yeah. And a crisis is an operational response. So there's a crisis team, and usually when you have a crisis, the way the company operates changes. So a crisis team has its own autonomy and can make its own decisions without going up to the CEO, who might be the leader of the crisis team, but probably isn't because the CEO's got to be out somewhere talking to people all the time. But you've got a crisis team, and that's an operational team, and they have to work together. They have to coordinate. They have to work with one voice and have one plan and one delivery. And the board sits above that, right? The board must be very closely connected to it, but they can't hold things up, and they can't be a separate entity operating their own crisis system either. And sometimes board members do get involved in a crisis, and in the BP one, we talked about clearly the chairman of the board of BP was over talking to Obama, who kept saying British Petroleum to make it clear the nationality of the company. So there is clearly a time when it's right for a board member to be involved. And of course, if the CEO's been sacked, for example, then the board's reputation is on the line as well, and you're going to be involved as well. So it depends a little bit about what it's all about, but you do need a line into it. But the key thing for the board is to look after your own interests, stay in touch, but stay quiet unless you decide that's not a sustainable thing to do and you need to change the way you do it. We work for an big Indonesian conglomerate. And one of the questions I kept getting asked from the communications people is, how do you stop the board people just talking? because they just go out and talk. They're people who are well known in the industry. They feel they have their own profile. You know, it's not a full-time job being on the board, and they will stand up and they will talk about the results of the company, for example, to anybody who cares to listen, to the media, and you get all sorts of conflicting information about that company that confuses the reporters and muddies the message and ruins your reputation potentially, and that happens in a crisis as well. And that's a very difficult position to be in as well. So the board has to be very responsive to that thought and make sure there's a joined up process with the leadership team at all times.
You do know that when the media, especially the international media, when they ask you a question, they already have the answer in their head. So when they ask you a question, they just want to check whether you're going to say the right thing or going to say the wrong thing. If you say the wrong thing, hey, headlines tomorrow. So how do you manage that? So when you look at it, you know, you must always be consistent. It's a little bit like MH370 when you have multiple people sitting in front and giving different scenarios and different reasons for what happened. I remember I was in MH, I was not in MAS, but I was in another organization where one of the media, the international media, came to me and asked me, said, Liz, I just want to have an opinion about what happened. Do you think it was the pilot? And he said, because the pilot was close to Anwar Ibrahim, and, you know, so that's what happened. And I said, come on, can you show me a passionate Malaysian who will kill themselves for a politician? It will never happen. So I said, you're funny. I said, but they were speculating about it, and they were actually thinking of writing a story. Imagine that. And I said, no, that's not true. We do not know what happened. And I'm not even part of the crisis. But they call you because why? They need a backgrounder. They need to know what's happening. And maybe Liz just might say something and, you know, yay, I have some background. So that kind of things do happen. And how you manage it is important. How you manage crisis is important. Because why? They're not getting the story from you. They do not know what happened. And until today, we do not know what happened. But it's okay, at least we do not know what happened as opposed to speculating something which is not true. But that's how the media works. That's how the social media work. And that's how the population works, the opinion leaders, yeah? So don't declare your victory. Don't be, we managed to clear this. This is great, we managed to do it. No, we did not. Because it's going to bite you 5 years down the road. People will still talk about one MDB for the next 10 years. We will still be known by that. We will still be known by the big crisis that happens. We are still being known for MH370, although that's, you know, years ago. And we mourn about it, still mourning. Yeah, so crises have a really long lifespan. It's how you manage it. The next crisis will actually show what kind of country that we are in. Yeah?
Yeah, and what I said at the beginning, 30 years ago, I was involved in the biggest crisis Shell has faced, and it's on the front page this week. So 30 years later, Shell is still defined by Nigeria, just as, but crisis is also an opportunity. So one of the things that is really important to remember is that if you do it well, you get credit from it. And there's a lot of people are covering a crisis just looking at how the company is managing the crisis rather than what the crisis itself is about, right? And you get a lot of credit or brickbats from that. And if you look at Johnson & Johnson, for example, that is still, I don't know whether people remember the Tylenol scandal. It was back in the 80s, but you know, in industry circles, Johnson & Johnson is still known as, you know, one of the best companies in terms of managing a crisis and protecting their customers, because there was a contamination of some Tylenol, and they withdrew everything, everywhere. So all the Tylenol came off the shelf, not just in the area where there was contamination, everywhere it came off. Not only that, they didn't put it back on the market until they had tamper-proof lids, and you could demonstrate that what you'd picked up could not have been tampered with, because it was a tampering problem. It wasn't contamination in their factory, it was somebody deliberately poisoning the Tylenol. And the way they handled that was good, and it's still being talked about today. So you can do it badly, and you can still be talked about, like ExxonMobil in Alaska, and Shell in Nigeria. Even though I was in Nigeria at the time, we could have done it a lot better. And And if you do it well, you get a lot of credit for it as well. And I think AirAsia came out quite well from the Surabaya crash because of the way it was handled, and the openness and the honesty and the feeling that went into it and the authenticity of the exchange, which is a complete contrast to Malaysian Airlines. But of course, the circumstances and the conditions and the pressures that the airlines are under were completely different. So you can't compare the two. You can understand why the two were different, but you can see where it worked and where it didn't. We've only got 5 minutes left.
And the other question is, are your leadership ready to be able to take the mic and speak to the media when there's a crisis? Are you ready to face it when the time comes? In most cases, you think you can answer the questions, but when in reality it's not as easy as you imagine to be. When you need to speak and when not to speak, how do you go about doing it? Do you do it with just you and a media, or you're going to have a press conference? When you're going to do the press conference? So there's a lot of element that comes out when there's a crisis. Managing crisis is one thing, and in many cases, in most organizations, you would be able to do your crisis management really well, but do you know how to communicate that crisis when it happens? So I think that's the key point when it comes to crisis management. And I think in a lot of cases, there's a lot of changes that you need to do in organization. Having a reputation risk as part of the board agenda is important. You know, looking at what will actually affect your reputation if things happen. So I'm sure the board would have that. And I know in some companies, I know the company that I'm in, they have reputation risk in there. Now, reputation risk is usually being practiced in banks because they have gone through a big crisis before, a reputation crisis where nobody trusts banks, and they're trying to pick it up, and they looked at it as it being very important. So how important reputation is to your organization?
And I think one of the things about that reputation risk is it's got to be owned in the boardroom or the leadership team. You have a risk, and there is an owner of that risk, and that person is accountable for making sure there is a mitigation plan in place and it's being managed. Because if that doesn't happen, it then becomes an exercise in process where normally it's the communications or the corporate affairs people who develop this risk matrix or the reputation risk chart. And unless they take ownership of it, it's never going to happen. They're never going to ask again about it. And I know that from bitter experience. In Shell, it used to be, your risk is Nigeria, your risk is Libya, or whatever it is, and the problems there that were happening a few years ago. And there's an owner. And every meeting, leadership meeting, the owner used to get asked, what are you doing about it? What do you know about it? And at the start, they all said, oh, I don't know, haven't found out, no clue. And if there isn't that commitment at the top to manage the high risks, they won't get managed, they won't get the profile they deserve, and they won't get the traction or the support or the money or the funding.
I'm sure there's some pressing questions, but nobody is asking questions. So if you have any pressing questions, we can take some, or we can always leave it as that, and we can talk at the corridor.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. My question is very simple. It's being a board member, is there a standard template or is there a standard framework? I know you've given some how to do things, a kind of policy that a board should have on its board charter that can be used?
Yes. Yes, of course. Of course, there's a template, the reputation risk template, because as I said, sometimes you already have a risk template in your organization, business risk template, right? Which actually answers all questions about what's happening, who these people are, where you want to go, your investment, or the country that you're going to go in. So there will be a template. Yes, we do. We don't have it here, but yes, we do. Yes.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, enterprise risk is managed at board level, but it's not done very well if you're looking at reputation risk. So some of the traditional ways of doing it, it's not so much the process. I think it's about understanding. The board has to understand what's going on, right? And as one of my old bosses, who's now a Kellogg fellow, I just read it online just now, said that if you're a board member and you just read the minutes, you read the pre-reading, you go to the board meeting and you have a site visit, you're not doing your job because you won't know what's going on. So it's about making yourself aware of all the different divergent external opinion that's going on about your company, about your risk profile, and understanding that to be able to make some judgment about what's important to your company, what risk profile you're expected or you're able to take, and how you respond to it. So really it's about personal understanding, and I think the process is not so difficult, I think, but it's having the right people with the right understanding who've, do you, in your board meetings, do you bring in external parties from NGOs, for example, who give you an alternate view of the company and say, this is what we think of you? So you're not always talking to the converted. It's not always the CEO and the leadership team telling you what they're doing and that it's right. So that's part of it.
And the other thing is investment risk, right? I find it a bit strange, sometimes organizations, when they go and do investment in other countries and they said, it's a fantastic investment, this country is investment friendly, they want you to come in, tax is very lax, and stuff like that. And then 3 years down the road, they said, oh my God, we can't take our money out. Because why? Policies have changed, government have changed, and now the policies, you can't take your money out. So our money is stuck. So now we have to find a creative way on how to take our money out. If not, why? We can't show that in our profit. So how didn't you not see that coming? So you need to look at what would be the regulatory risk in these countries, what would be the political risk. And I think even in Malaysia, when we had the change of government, I think a lot of companies, multinationals, were a bit afraid. What's going to happen next? How are we going to do our business, right? And of course, not much changes. In fact, people want to come in and invest according to our new budget. So think about it. So if you're not aware of what's happening, if you don't look at what would be the political risk and the reputation of that particular company, who are the leaders, who are the leaders in that country, who are they affiliate to, so then chances are you are at risk. Your reputation's at risk. Your shareholders is going to look at you and say, hey, you make a bad investment. You shouldn't have done that in the first place. You are investing a lot of money, but you're not getting returns. So think about it. So reputation is that. Reputation is about, understanding who are the people that you are talking to, what are you going to say to them? Are they reputable? Can they be trusted? Can you be trusted? That's what reputation is all about. So it's not as easy as you imagine it to be, and it's kind of vague, and, can't really put what are the criteria on it.
And we're out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time. Any other question? We can take one more.
I think take one more. How do you measure reputational capital, and how do you build up on it?
I like that question. Reputation capital is basically like, your share price. And maybe, I don't know, for me, share price goes up for no reason. Suddenly they decided they like you. Building reputational capital is making people trust you and who you are, making the right investment decisions. Because they have their money with you. They are your shareholder. So that's building reputation capital if you were to look at the long-term impact of it. Because I think in most cases, board will say, why is our share price kept going down? And you see the CEO looking at you and trying to answer that question because they can't really answer the question because sometimes it happens. And today you're not the favorite of the analyst, right? So maybe building reputation capital, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, building reputation capital is looking at your share price. If you were to look at the ultimate, impact of how you have done your reputation management.
Yes, it's an interesting question because there's no figure at the end of it says your reputation capital is 25 or something, and that's good. So it's all about your stakeholders, understanding your stakeholders and engaging them, building trust, right? So how do you know they trust you? Well, you find out in a crisis, because if something goes wrong and they know you're good guys and you keep telling them that they know what you're doing and they know that what's happened is something that was out of your control, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt and they will go easy on you and then you'll survive. So you find out in a crisis whether you've built a reputation capital. You can measure it in research, so you can go and ask questions. You can do it online. You can do qualitative and quantitative research and ask questions about what do you think about your company. Do you trust? You can ask questions about trust. You can work out how favorably people are thinking about you. So there are ways of measuring it, and you've got to do that regularly over time so you can see the change. A one-off doesn't tell you very much. And you can measure yourself against competitors. So there is a way of measuring it. But it's about how you, it's about understanding your stakeholders and who's important to you, and making sure you're close to them and they understand you and they like you and they trust you, and you build that trust. It's a little bit elusive, can be measured, and that capital helps you when things go wrong. If you don't have it, everybody will believe the worst straight away, as they did BP for a long time afterwards. BP is beginning to recover from it now.
Sorry, just one quick question. Who do you think is the best person to manage the reputation risk in the company? Because it can come from all sorts of departments, right? So who do you think is the best person to really like manage it all? Because there should be one point contact really, right?
Who do you think?
Well, we tried the corporate comm, we tried legal, we tried risk even, but there's no, there's no really right person.
Okay, I've got several ways of answering that. and one is that one answer is communications, right? That's what I do. That's why I'm working in communications, because I'm looking at risk and reputation risk. I understand the outside world. I can advise the organization, this is what you must do. This is what people expect of you. If you don't do this, this will be the consequence. What are we going to do? Let's go and talk to them. These are the issues, yeah? These are the dilemmas. Let's work together for solutions, right? So it's the people who are externally focused are the people who should be advising you. So I think that's fairly clear. So if you're looking at board or leadership team, you need somebody in there who's got that external view. And often on the leadership team, legal or finance will have the communications people reporting to them. And they will have no expertise in that area, so you don't get that exposure in that area in the leadership team, so it doesn't come in. So that's the answer, I think. Now, if you have a communications organization, as happens a lot in Malaysia, not just Malaysia, I'm not being critical of Malaysia, all over the place, a lot of different countries, you hire people in communications because they're good at two things. One, doing press releases and talking to the media. Two, running events. You're hiring people who are experienced in tactical management of communications, and then you ask them to look at strategy and reputation risk, and you haven't got the right people there often to do that, because you're not hiring people to do that. If you hire the right people to do that, you will do that. People like Liz, who was doing that job for Petronas for some time, who can think in those terms. But often in organizations, your job description does not include that. And therefore, when you go and ask them to do something like that, they won't be able to do it.
So the answer is comms. I would like to think that the comms people would be able to do reputation risk. But again, you need to work with the risk to understand the parameters, work with legal, also finance, to look at the parameters on how you quantify risk, reputation risk. It needs to be comms, because comms needs to be responsible not just about writing press releases and doing events, but also holding accountable for the reputation of the organization. And again, in order for them to be accountable for the reputation of the organization, it's the organization leadership needs to communicate as often as you can to the comms people so that they can be effective. So that's a different fight altogether, which we're not going to talk about it. But I think it's important that communications within the organization, that and the comms people understand what's happening and understand that the organizations are here in Malaysia, or Malaysian organization. You are here to obtain the license to operate, and license to operate is very important. As long as they understand that and their job is to support the business, then that's where your reputation risk.
Yeah, I'm not being critical of communications people, but it depends on what your job description is and who you're hiring because of it. And to have that influence on reputation, you've got to be in the room when decisions are made. And I spent most of my life in Shell not being in the room. And you get a decision made in a leadership team, we're going to go and invest here. And then you look at them and they say, and you say, look, there's a big risk if you do that. They say, well, go and fix it. That's your job, No, my job is to advise you whether you should or should not do it. Or if you're going to make a decision, let's make that decision with all this information in front of you so that you can make a considered decision and understand the risk you're running, because you make a decision without understanding the risk and then tell somebody to go and fix it. And then the communications person is, whoever they are, in a difficult position because you can't fix the unfixable, and there's people coming in. So I really think we ought to stop.
Any other question? Okay,
Yes.
so
All right. Thank you very much. That's our session for
Sorry,
this
okay,
morning.
just one last advice. If you ever go into a crisis, don't ever say no comment, because no comment is a comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much